you, Sandhya. Because within that overall, I would say overarching picture, there are a number of sector-specific, skill-specific initiative and region-specific initiatives that are taking place, which will kind of, again, I would say, which we can respond to on the basis of particular questions. So I'd just like to open, Pratik.
Thank you so much for the very comprehensive presentation. I just have a few couple of clarifications. You spoke about primary research and identifying skill gaps in the country. I just want to know, what does this primary research entail exactly? And you also mentioned the demographic dividend. Would you happen to have a figure for, say, the percentage of youth, by youth I mean say less than 35 years, who are skilled or in skill development programs as such?
Typically, skill development programs tend to focus on the youth. So if I tell you that 10% of the Indian population is undergoing formal skill training, it's quite likely that most of them is the youth population. If you look at ITIs, their courses are open to people who are in the 14 to 40 age group. But typically, people who choose to get skilled have to see value in that skilling. Unless they get a higher wage after that, they will not undergo that skilling. So the composition of the classrooms in skill training institutes is often below 30. And in terms of primary research, we conducted extensive primary research for the National Skill Development Corporation for the district level study that I mentioned. So for identifying quantitative gaps, it's possible to do that using state level statistics and looking at employment figures and industry employment figures and so on. But to identify those qualitative skill gaps, we need stakeholder interactions. So what we did was we conducted in-depth face-to-face interviews with governments, district level officials, industry experts. We conducted case studies with NGOs and other skill training providers who are working in that space. We conducted focus group discussions with the youth to understand what their aspirations are. And we also conducted field surveys in the unorganized sector to trace what sort of information channels are operating there.
Sorry, just a suggestion, when somebody is asking a question, could you please, throw out your answers to all of us, because
I'm sorry.
you are in the group.
Sure.
Sometimes I have the same questions as her, I don't have to repeat, sorry. Just a humble suggestion.
1, 2, 3.
Me first?
Okay.
My short question, because you mentioned that 100% FDI is allowed in skills development. You're saying that there are no restrictions or regulatory restrictions faced by foreign investors in skills development. What's the distinction between formal education and vocational training?
Right. So formal education would typically be K to 12 education. That is school education, kindergarten to class 12, and
It's not allowed.
that can be, you can invest in that sector, but it has to be a non-profit entity. Whereas in skill development, it's possible to have a for-profit entity. And if you look at degree courses, graduation courses, master's courses, these come under the ambit of formal education. Vocational education would be a polytechnic, a diploma, a particular course that imparts a specific skill. That's what we're referring to as vocational training. And 100% FDI is allowed in that sector.
But there are no regulatory restrictions at all.
There is a regulatory framework that is beginning to be developed at the moment, but there are restrictions at the moment.
Myself, Arunachalam. Actually, I am involving in the training in Singapore. Exactly, Madam asked the contact, to whom to contact in the state-wise or in the general-wise. We have no idea about it. We definitely need of contacts. To whom to approach to start a training institute or vocational institute. Because it's very general. It doesn't serve our purpose. We need exact contacts.
No, I can answer that in reverse. I mean, if you send her a mail on which are the states and which are the kind of skills you are interested in, she will send you back the contact person. You tell us where you want to work, what skills you want to work, and what levels you want to work. You want to work at the entry level, you want to work at the higher level, and she will tell you the kind of persons to contact.
So we will be getting these slides because I don't find any contacts here.
I think I'll make sure that
there's no contacts here. Even your
I
contact.
in contact. I saw.
For the right training, get a contact.
Yeah. We'll pass on, we'll make sure. We'll make sure you get it.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Joseph KV. I'm apologies for coming late. Just coming from some conference. My question is directed to Sandeep regarding the NSDC. There are two parts. It's initiated in 2009 and ended in 2022. So after 4 years, I'd like to ask you, how are we doing on that average for the 150 million people coming to the outside? And secondly, you refer to the Singaporean businesses in Indian skill development. If you can highlight some examples of what kind of business you can collaborate.
Right. So, in terms of the NSDC skilling target, it has a mandate of skilling 150 million people. So far, it's trained a little over 280,000 people. But since they're developing partnerships with different institutes, and since these are all scalable models, and each of their partners is required to skill at least 100,000 people over 10 years, we can expect that this number will continue to expand over time.
Can you elaborate how the funding takes place?
Right. So funding, they provide 3 forms of funding. They provide loans, soft loans at 6 to 7%
Through
interest
banks
rates.
or who provides?
The National Skill Development Corporation provides it to private entities who want to enter the skill development space in India. They provide soft loans to them with repayment moratoriums at relatively lower interest rates of 6 to 7%. And they also provide equity infusion. So essentially, if we look at the role of the NSDC as a funding body, we can treat it like a private equity firm that's focusing only on skill development in India. And I'm sorry,
The second part was regarding Singaporean context. Singaporean businesses how to collaborate.
Right. So there is already a memorandum of understanding that has been signed between SMU and the Delhi state government to set up a world-class training institute in Delhi. So this is one of the initiatives that is already underway in India. If we look at other initiatives that are possible, definitely knowledge partnership is one area that I think there is a great deal of interest in on both sides based on the sort of interactions that we've had. There is interest from Indian players in getting content support from Singaporean players since you have greater expertise in this area. It's an area that's more well developed in Singapore, and most of the things that Singapore has already done is something that India is beginning to do now. For example, we're beginning to track students after they're placed. It was something that wasn't done earlier. We'd have no inventory of who's been skilled and who's not.
These 150 million people, are they what kind of population? Are they student population or another one?
150 million, so it does not specify a certain demographic that needs to be skilled. It just says 150 million people, but typically the focus tends to be on the youth population.
Hi, Gaurav. I have a quick question on the use of technology innovation for vocational training. So you mentioned a few times that the way to actually make it a for-profit venture would be to leverage on technology and innovation. So once the institutes that are already in place, how exactly do they use technology innovation? Do they use e-learning, or what exactly do they do?
Right. So if we look at existing initiatives, if we look at MeritTrack, for example, MeritTrack has a very low-cost operating model because all the tests that they offer to anybody who has access to any sort of internet, they offer these tests online. So that significantly reduces their costs. They have partner institutes to make sure that the testing is properly monitored and it's properly administered, but they've leveraged technology to a huge extent in that sense. There are other NSDC partners. For example, there is an institute called Talent Sprint in Tamil Nadu. So what they are doing is they need to focus on skilling rural and backward areas as well. And reaching these areas or setting up infrastructure in these areas often doesn't make sense because you have a few classes a week. It does not make sense to lease a building there to set up infrastructure in a backward area in order to skill them. So what they do is they set up partnerships with local NGOs, local training providers, and the students come to these NGOs. They use these NGOs as centers, and the classes that are happening are broadcast live live, real time to the students. So again, that helps them cut costs. And it also, it's greater service to society because you're trying to reach a larger section of the population, and technology in a great way enables you to do that. So to not leverage that does not make sense in this space.
Yeah, Ms.
Sandy.
Okay, I think regarding funding, if I heard correctly, you said 25% for the private sector that you will fund.
Right.
Does this mean that, what do you call it, is there something as a contribution by corporations? See, we have, for example, in Singapore, we have got a skill development fund. No one escapes that. All the companies are paying the skill development fund, so they can send the people for training, and this fund is used to the government. Is that something that is being incorporated now in India?
It's not being incorporated in that sense. So when I said 25% funding, I was referring exclusively to the initiatives that NSDC is funding. NSDC funds private players who want to enter skill development. So all that NSDC is saying is that if you want to enter the skill development space, I will provide up to 75% funding to you, but at least 25% of the capital has to be put up by you.
I see. So you say, for example, Indian companies want to send their people for training. Okay? We have got to come out with 25%. Am I correct?
Sorry?
They will have to come up with a 25% funding for training?
No, that's not the case. That's not the case.
I think the point she was making is that there is a government space with a large number of training institutions which are fairly subsidized. So the companies want to send their people to the government training institutions, they can do so. And that is fully paid for. If they want to set up a private training institution for, like Toyota wants to set up an institution for its own needs, then in that case it can approach the National Skill Development Council, and the National Skill Development Council will give them money to support their own initiatives. So it's a kind of subsidy given by the government for private sector to set up its own. Or if you want to go to the government sector, that's fine.
Because India is a very big country, it's different from Singapore. We buy our chips, you have to. But a number of things that you have presented is very closely related to what we have been doing, And what do you call it? One of the things that maybe you all could look up is that Singapore benefited from Japan. The Asia Pacific, I don't know whether it's still around. You got the, what do you call it, productivity board. I was one of the recipients of this training by the Japanese in the 80s. Okay, now possibly. Now that Japan is going in a manufacturing side, because when you get training, it's so many different factors. You go to the manufacturing side, maybe training. Maybe you could consider the Japanese. I don't know whether this board is still around or not, but they used to have a very strong board, the Asia Productivity Board, and India was a member. We were trained by the Japanese trade. We don't accept everything, but we were very good. Very good indeed. So that is something that
John?
Santia, do you want to speak?
Just to say, I think the sector skill councils are also trying to do that in terms of establishing productivity by industry. That's something that the sector skill councils are looking to address, to make sure that there is a certain minimum level of skill. So by undergoing a certain type of training, there are at least, there's a minimum level of ability that a person who has undergone that training has. So in a limited way, the sector skill councils are seeking to address that.
And one big problem is language, especially with mass training. So it's basically it'll be training the trainers, and then the Indian trainers will train the mass.
Right.
Otherwise, you get foreigners to go and do that, it's going to be very difficult.
Right.
Two questions, Sandy. First, it seems to me that the plans in terms of numbers of people who are to get skill training over the fairly short period are pretty ambitious. And I'm wondering to what extent these may be constrained by the limitations of basic education in the country. I mean, I think of the research
that shows fairly high proportions of people who even have completed primary education who aren't able to do a simple subtraction or actually to read a simple sentence. I just wonder a little bit about whether the plans for skill development are going to be undercut by the limitations of basic education. Secondly, in your introduction, you did refer to the historic sort of problems of in a sense, the demand side limitations in regard to skill training and the problems of opportunity cost for people. And that particular problem didn't sort of reappear in your presentation of what's going on now. And I wonder whether that's a problem which is no longer seen as being significant, or whether there's some other reason why it didn't appear later in your presentation.
So, to answer your first question, if we look at basic education, it's a huge constraint in India. In our primary research, what came up over and over again was that a person who enters a skill training institute has to have a minimum level of qualification. They have to be at least, they should have completed at least class 8 or something of that sort. So even if they've completed class 8, often they're not able to understand what's going on in class. Attrition from skill training institutes is another problem that many of them are facing. And this is a problem because in India, for example, for the first 8 years, a student is not allowed to fail. Under the right to education, a student cannot fail a grade up to class 8. It's only from class 9 that they'll have to take exams anyway. But if they fail, they'll still be promoted. So particularly in government schools, this creates a sort of disincentive for teachers to care too much about weak students. So there are a lot of students who don't understand what's going on in class because they don't know the basics, they don't understand the tools, they don't have the tools that are required to acquire skills. And that is an area that we've been talking about quite a lot. We have spoken to a lot of policymakers, and greater collaboration between these different departments is something that we've advocated a lot. It's definitely a gap that the Department of School Education and the Department of Higher Education and the Department of Technical Education are not working together. Because for a person to be skilled, it involves interventions at each stage. It's not something that happens at one stage. It's not that you put a skill training institute at the end and he's all right and he can perform jobs. So this is definitely a constraint that the Indian market is facing. It's a huge problem. To answer your other question in terms of the problems that I mentioned earlier about dignity of labor and other socio-economic constraints, these are things that there are measures to meet these problems. There are initiatives that are trying to address these problems. They're met with partial success. In terms of dignity of labor, for example, the National Skill Development Corporation set up an initiative called Hunar Hai To Kadar Hai. So that roughly translates to if you have skill, you will be respected. So the idea is to ingrain it in the psyche of the people that it's more important to have a job than to not have a job and say I will only do a white collar job. So these are issues that are being addressed in small steps by different agencies in India. And the reason it didn't come up again in the presentation is that this is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed by the country itself. It's something that requires a societal change, it requires a change in mindset, it requires people to adopt new ideas. And there are other problems also that plague this sector. I mean, for example, skilling women is very difficult. There are socio-economic constraints to skilling women. In many backward areas, women will just not be allowed to come and become skilled. So there are initiatives, there are NGOs that adopt the self-help group model, or they have only female trainers to train the women. So these are issues that are beginning to be addressed. The skill development landscape in India is extremely complex. It's got a lot of components in it, and it's got a lot of layers of complexity which, in addition to there being qualitative and quantitative skill gaps, make it very difficult for any one field to come and address it. It requires collaboration among different stakeholders, which is why we say that having a local partner becomes very important for any international player who wants to enter the market.
Hi, my name is Asim. I'm co-founder of Give Asia. We use ICT for non-profits in Asia. One of the fact, which is a very glaring fact, is that the employment exchanges in India, there are about 1,200 of them. They provided jobs to only 30,000 people last year, whereas there are about 40 million people registered on those exchanges. So what is really happening there? Is it most of these 40 million people are not employable? Because is it even people who are graduating from universities? I recently read a report which said that only 5% of students graduating from MBA are actually employable. So is this, as you mentioned, it's such a systemic error? How do entrepreneurs go in and change the whole ecosystem when the issue is at such a scale? Have you seen any success stories?
I'll answer part. I think just a correction. The employment exchanges address only government employment. So you don't really want 40 million people working for government. So there are 40 million people registered and 30,000. I would hesitate to say it's bad or good, but I think we don't want to expand government in that sense. But the other part about the skill sector employment here.
In terms of employability, this is something that comes up frequently in any project that we do. For example, in our interactions with the industry, they say that we have so many engineering colleges. Tamil Nadu is a hub for engineering colleges. So we produce more engineering graduates than any other state in India. But they say that about 25% of these graduates are employable. They're ready to be taken up by the industry. So this is a problem of, again, relevance of the curriculum. Because the industry is not involved in how that curriculum gets drafted or updated, it has no relevance to what's going on in the industry. You have trainers who have never worked, they've never seen what a BPO looks like, and they're teaching their students to be skilled for what is going to come 5 years later when they don't know what the current scenario is. And that causes a gap, which is why there are now initiatives for greater industry involvement. And that's how we say that the private sector can bridge this gap, because for there to be relevance of skills, there have to be players who understand what those skills are and what the industry needs.
Big employers, I'm talking of people who employ 30, 40, 50,000 people. I will take the IT sector, Infosys, TCS, Wipro, etc. They take these people and run them through a training program which is suitable to their own needs, and they spend money on it. Now, the question is opportunity cost. Should this be an industry cost or should it be a public cost? I mean, that's a larger question. Whether they should be spending that and should it not be available in the government itself. It is actually double expenditure. But this is how it is being addressed. I mean, big companies, particularly automobile, particularly Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, Nissan, etc., they have their own training institutions. So they have their own standards of manufacturing. So they take these kids and keep them train them, and they're only employed. That is how the skill gap is currently being addressed. I wouldn't call it the most efficient way or the most cost-effective way of addressing it, but that's how it's happening.
Just a follow-up question. If you're seeing that there's additional requirement for a skill training institute to provide these skills to university students to increase their chances of employability, what do you see at the ground level? Is the psyche of students like, I just paid for my university, this is not doing it for me. I'm fine with spending more money from my parents or from working jobs and increasing my employability? Or are they saying that I spent enough, I don't really care about spending more to increase my chances of employment?
See, this will depend on the target student. If you're looking at someone who comes from poor financial circumstances to begin with, expecting them to invest in additional skill training obviously is kind of unrealistic. But that's why we say that a placement linkage makes or breaks a skill training institute. If you tell someone that you spend 20,000 on this course, and I guarantee you that you will get a job that pays you 8,000 rupees a month on completion of this course, then he might be willing to take that loan or to make that investment because he sees that there is a return to that skill. if you can market your skill as something that will provide employability, that will generate income in the future, then there will be willingness for them to acquire those skills. Because at the end of university education, if they're not employable, it doesn't make much of a difference what that education did for them. So they're upset with that. They're disgruntled that they've undergone university, the bachelor's or whatever other course they did, and they're still not getting a job. But if you tell them that I put you through a 12-month program and you will get a job, there is no reason why they would not be interested in it.
Are there such institutes which are providing this kind of guarantee?
There are lots of institutes. Lots of them.
Which provide that guarantee that you will get a job?
Lots of
Who's
them.
certificate?
NIIT is a huge player in
NIT.
But I know that, I mean, not everyone gets job here. Probably the top 10, 20.
No. There are institutes whose certificates, actually carry 100%. Absolutely. Let's go out and get it done.
Okay, Cynthia, sorry, just a follow-up, yeah? A very short one. Okay, now that you are talking about it, I feel that there's something wrong maybe in the system. Okay, if I'm going to do a course or something like that, can I come with my own system? Is it feasible? That I can see some goals and objectives, they will be achieved by what I'm putting forward to, all right? Because I know this system is not going to work. Will there be any kind of repercussions and stuff like that?
The way we see it, there is an opportunity because there is a problem with the system. If there was no problem with the system, then India can take care of it. We don't need any other player to come in and provide that infrastructure. But since there is a market gap there, since there is a problem with the provision of skill training, since there is a lack of employability in people who go through college or go through these skill training institutes, that's what creates that opportunity. It's possible for an external player who understands the market, if it's possible for him to impart skills that the industry sees value in, that the industry will pay for, then there's no reason why that model would not function.
The other thing is, I think she mentioned in passing that there's a huge supply gap. For example, in the state of Tamil Nadu, really workers in factories, workers in farms are just not available. There's a huge shortage. Chakravarti, similarly in Andhra. Similarly in Karnataka.
Pan-India construction sector, you have a huge gap.
Yeah, construction sector, there's a huge gap. So on the one side, you have a huge mass of people who are not skilled. The other side, industry is facing a huge problem in recruiting skilled people. So this is, it's, to me mind, is an unbelievable mismatch which is happening in the country now. Last question.
In the context of the missing link, in regard to your narration on Empower issue, what the missing link is that we need to know the labor relation. The question, do you have a working people, white people with the ILO, for example, perspective ones, employment dimension, ecosystem, that is very important for investors to come in. Because the labor relation in India, union and non-union, is very, very important and very, it's caring to know that the freedom of speech, freedom of everything. So the question is that you have a white people coming along because your project seems to be a very huge one. 190 million it's not a joke. But the question is that, so, and strangely enough, yeah.
1 minute.
Okay. Ironically, Japan is not within the 8 that you mentioned. Why?
No, question, please.
My question is just as I say, you don't have that.
Yeah.
And the second one is that why Japan is not in?
All right. Okay. Next, can you take the question?
So my question was simply that India in general is known for a lot of bureaucracy and red tape. Now, if an entrepreneur were to try and set up a training institute in India, given that it's a priority sector, have you, in your experience, seen the government fast track all necessary requirements that it takes to set up something in this space, or will it take the same amount of time?
So 2 questions. One is, do we have an overall labor kind of agreement for managing the labor yet? Or 2 is government?
Right. So in terms of labor, there isn't an umbrella policy that takes care of things. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why this problem with understanding labor policy and the problems with unionization of labor and so on is one of the reasons why a lot of the hiring tends to be unorganized. I mentioned that informal employment is very high. That's because a lot of industries tend to go, even large industries tend to hire informally. They tend to hire contract labor because in those cases they don't have an obligation towards that worker. And this is definitely an area that requires to be addressed in a different way. But as I see it, this is a problem that's more relevant to the industry than to a skill training provider. A skill training provider catches hold of a student, helps him get skilled and helps him get a job. But unionization and labor and contracts and security and so on, these are things that are more relevant to the industry. They're industry specific. So, and to answer your question, see right now, in our case, in our experience, I won't say that we've seen a case where the government fast tracks things, but it's probably easier to set up a skill training institute today than it was a few years ago, because skill is recognized as a priority sector, and there are governments which will, they may not fast track things for you, but they will provide a conducive environment for you. If there is a skill development mission that is very active, that has a certain target of skilling to meet, and you go up to them and say, look, I'll set up a public-private partnership and I'll do this, or I'll set up a skill training institute. Definitely in terms of basic support, like information, or what are the procedures, how do I go about this, there is a greater amount of support, there is a greater development of that ecosystem in India at present than there was.
Thank you. I must regretfully end this. Thank you very much, and thank you, Sandhya. I think we had very useful discussions. Of course, it's a large topic, so in a way we are just putting up a big umbrella, and within that umbrella you have to look at specific projects, specific problems, specific areas, specific regions, specific skills. So much specificity involved, and that would perhaps take us to the next level of detailing in these projects. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for